Okay, stay with me for a moment. BECAUSE. What unfolded in Washington recently is not just another political clash or routine partisan drama. This is something deeper, something structural, and something that rarely happens in modern American politics. Late last week, according to multiple reports, the President of the United States personally contacted a sitting U.S. Senator from his own party and angrily confronted her over a vote that limited his authority. Not a member of the opposition, not a political rival, a Republican senator, part of his own coalition. The reason matters. She supported legislation designed to restrict presidential war powers. What you're about to hear is not about a single phone call, but about what that call revealed. To understand why this moment is different, you have to step back and look at the pattern forming underneath the headlines. Asterisk, what we are seeing is not political theater. It is not the familiar Washington routine where lawmakers express concern, issue carefully worded statements, and ultimately fall back in line. This time, something broke through that script. For the first time in years, a group of Republican senators moved beyond rhetoric and took concrete legislative action to curb a sitting president's authority on matters of war and emergency power. That alone is historically unusual. But what makes this moment significant is not just the vote itself, it's the internal resistance behind it. Organized, deliberate, and openly defiant resistance coming from within the president's own party. Asterisk, to grasp how unusual this is, you have to imagine the atmosphere on Capitol Hill at the time. It was late, offices were mostly dark, but phones were lighting up across Senate buildings. Staffers were checking vote counts, refreshing internal communications, and trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The president was not attacking Democrats or media outlets. He was directing his anger inward, toward his own party. And unlike previous moments, this time, the pressure did not work. Senators did not retreat. They did not reverse course. They absorbed the backlash and continued forward. Asterisk, that distinction matters. Anyone who has followed American politics closely knows the difference between symbolic dissent and real resistance. Lawmakers often criticize presidents publicly while quietly supporting them in practice. This has been especially common in recent years. Statements of concern followed by near-total loyalty in votes. But this was not symbolic. This was Republicans crossing party lines to advance a war powers resolution, a legal mechanism designed to limit the president's ability to deploy military force without congressional approval. Asterisk, think carefully about what that implies. Members of the president's own party assessed his recent statements, his posture toward foreign policy, and the potential consequences of unilateral action, and concluded that legal guardrails were necessary. That is not a routine policy disagreement. That is an institutional intervention, and the president's reported response to that intervention is what made the situation escalate. Asterisk, according to multiple accounts, the president reacted with anger rather than negotiation. Instead of outreach or dialogue, he reportedly confronted a Republican senator who supported the resolution using harsh and confrontational language. Whether one focuses on the tone or the substance, the message was clear. The vote was viewed not as a constitutional check, but as personal disloyalty, and that reaction tells us a great deal about how power is being understood in this moment. Asterisk. When a leader responds to constitutional limits with fury instead of engagement, it signals something deeper than frustration. It reveals a view of power as personal rather than institutional, as something owned, not delegated, something to be defended, not shared. That perception is precisely what triggered the internal resistance now unfolding. But to fully understand why Republican senators felt compelled to act, we have to examine what set this chain of events in motion. Asterisk, the catalyst, surprisingly to some, was not a classified briefing or a secret memo. It was a series of public statements. The president repeatedly raised the possibility of using military force to acquire Greenland, a territory governed by Denmark, a NATO ally. At first glance, many dismissed the comments as rhetorical or exaggerated, but they were made publicly, on multiple occasions, without clear retraction. And that is where concern turned into alarm. Asterisk, to understand why this matters, it's essential to understand how NATO functions. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty establishes collective defense. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. Greenland is Danish territory. Any military action against it would not exist in isolation. It would implicate the entire alliance. Senators with access to classified briefings understand how quickly escalation can occur, and how statements alone can alter strategic calculations. Asterisk, what lawmakers were forced to confront was not a hypothetical scenario, but a risk pathway. Words spoken by a U.S. president carry weight. They influence allies, adversaries, and military planners. Once the possibility of force is publicly placed on the table, it cannot simply be undone by clarification. That is why senators describe the situation not as negotiation, but as destabilizing. Asterisk, in previous eras, rhetoric of this nature would have ended political careers, but the political environment has changed. To understand why this rhetoric persists, one must understand the worldview driving it. The president's approach to international relations differs sharply from traditional frameworks. Alliances are viewed less as mutual commitments and more as transactional arrangements. Treaties are treated as leverage rather than binding obligations. International law is approached as optional, depending on perceived advantage. That worldview functions in business negotiations, where parties can walk away or renegotiate terms. But international politics does not operate under those conditions. States have militaries. Alliances have trigger points. Words have consequences that cannot be reversed by a follow-up call. When military force is mentioned in relation to allied territory, it alters planning assumptions across governments. Republican senators understand this reality. Many have participated in briefings that outline how miscalculation leads to escalation. They know that uncertainty itself is destabilizing. That is why fear, not ideology, drove their response. Not fear of political backlash, but fear of consequences they could not control once set in motion. The War Powers Act exists for precisely this scenario. Created after Vietnam, it was designed to prevent presidents from unilaterally committing the nation to military conflict without congressional authorization. It is intended as an emergency brake, rarely used. The fact that members of the president's own party invoked it is extraordinary, and it signaled a fundamental shift. The reported phone call with Senator Collins was not about one vote. It was about control. It revealed how resistance is interpreted within this administration, not as constitutional function, but as betrayal. And that perception matters because it shapes how future dissent is treated. The failure of intimidation in this case marked a turning point. The senators did not reverse their positions. The pressure did not succeed. And that failure carries long-term implications. Political loyalty is transactional. It persists as long as it provides benefit and protection. When the costs outweigh the rewards, alliances dissolve. Republican senators are now reassessing the balance. They are evaluating war rhetoric, emergency declarations, and political volatility against their own institutional responsibilities. This is not ideological math. It is risk assessment. At the same time, another front opened. While Congress moved to restrict war powers, the president declared a national emergency related to Venezuelan oil assets. On the surface, the declaration was framed as energy security, but closer examination raised questions. The timeline for tangible benefits extends years into the future. Infrastructure requirements are massive. Immediate domestic impact is limited. What the declaration does accomplish, however, is a shift in authority. Emergency declarations concentrate power within the executive branch. They allow bypassing normal legislative procedures and oversight. Emergencies are intended for immediate threats, not strategic convenience. Yet the pattern is consistent. As scrutiny increases, emergencies multiply. The conversation shifts from accountability to urgency, from oversight to crisis response. This is not accidental. It is a governing strategy. Overwhelm the system. Change the subject. Raise the stakes. Hope attention moves elsewhere. This pattern has been observed repeatedly, and lawmakers are increasingly aware of it. While headlines focus on dramatic confrontations, a quieter process is unfolding beneath the surface. Oversight, documentation, timelines, procedural accountability. Senators have begun asking detailed questions about delayed disclosures, missed deadlines, and unexplained extensions. These are not accusations. They are process inquiries, and process inquiries are often more consequential than speeches. Paper trails do not respond to rhetoric. Records persist. Emails, memos, approvals, and timelines remain accessible to subpoenas. When the gap between public statements and documented actions grows, credibility erodes. And once credibility is questioned, every future explanation faces heightened scrutiny. This is the scenario the administration is attempting to avoid. Oversight is not optional in a functioning democracy. It is the mechanism that ensures power remains accountable. When oversight is treated as sabotage rather than function, institutional stability begins to degrade. Republican senators are not only thinking about the present moment, they are thinking about precedent. Constitutional norms, once weakened, do not automatically repair themselves. Powers claimed today become tools available tomorrow. If emergencies can be declared to bypass Congress without consequence, future presidents will do the same. If threats against allies carry no cost, future leaders will escalate further. This is why some Republicans are drawing lines now, not because of personal animosity, but because of institutional preservation. They are asking whether Congress will retain meaningful authority if these precedents stand. That calculation is structural, not ideological. Once a president establishes that personal judgment overrides law, treaties, and constitutional limits, the office itself changes. It ceases to be constrained by the system and begins to dominate it. Some lawmakers are attempting, carefully and quietly, To prevent that transformation, these debates have real-world consequences. Military families feel the impact of war rhetoric. Workers feel the consequences of destabilized trade relationships. Markets react to unpredictability. Allies reassess commitments. Trust erodes gradually, not in a single moment, but cumulatively. Emergency powers used for political leverage distort economic signals. Resources flow toward priorities shaped by narrative rather than necessity. Ordinary people bear the cost of unpredictability. Stability is not abstract. It is the foundation that allows people to plan, invest, and live with confidence. So where does this lead? No outcome is predetermined. Politics is too complex, too contingent for certainty. But there are indicators to watch. Whether the war powers resolution survives, whether oversight requests proceed or stall, whether internal Republican resistance grows or isolates itself, whether dissenting lawmakers face consequences or endure. These signals will determine whether this moment marks a genuine institutional correction or a temporary disruption. Beneath it all lies a larger question. Are the rules governing power stronger than the individuals who hold office? Every democracy confronts this test eventually. Systems endure only when people choose to defend them. Not automatically, not effortlessly, through conscious decision. Right now, that choice is being made unevenly, imperfectly, but visibly. Resistance is no longer external, it is internal, from those who once defended this president and are now drawing limits. That shift does not guarantee outcomes. History offers many warnings of systems that bent too far, but it also shows moments when lines were drawn in time. We are in such a moment. What happens next depends on whether enough people decide that constraints still matter, that power must remain accountable, that institutions must function even when inconvenient. Democracy does not protect itself. It relies on individuals willing to uphold it. Lawmakers who prioritize oath over advantage. Institutions that value process over loyalty. Citizens who remain engaged even when exhausted. Some of that is happening now. Not enough for certainty, but enough to matter. The coming weeks will reveal whether this resistance becomes durable or fades. The answer will shape not just this presidency, but the structure of power long after it ends.